Okay, good evening. I am John Schroeder. I know most of you know that already, but the important thing is remember that these are being recorded for YouTube, and so therefore the things that you're already familiar with I have to cover just to make sure that new viewers on YouTube are aware of it. Disclaimer right here is letting you know that you are getting the information from the Edgar Cayce readings according to the Gospel of John Schroeder, me. So I have taken the time to be able to look at the Edgar Cayce readings that will be presented this evening, and I'm giving you my interpretation of them. It is an interpretation. It does not mean it is the interpretation or speaking for the ARE itself. So that's what happens with volunteer organizations. You never know what's going to happen, do you? So I invite you to be able to do all the research on this topic that you would like. And at the end of this presentation, I put an email address up there for those of you in YouTube land to be able to email me and actually get a copy not only of the readings themselves, but even of this PowerPoint presentation, the slides. Actually, at the very end of this, there's some that you may be interested in having a copy of. So I wanted to start off by being able to identify, if you're not used to the Edgar Cayce readings, what it is you're going to see here. This is a quote from one of the readings, the Search for God material. That's a, can I borrow your book for a second, Max? This book, A Search for God, was a group was put together in Edgar Cayce's home back. It started in 1931. It took them 12 years to be able to use Cayce's readings and use that material to be able to put this book together. And from that, they developed 25 chapters, if you include the one on meditation, chapters that are given in a specific sequence so that you can be able to get from the Cayce material a search for God, how to be able to become a better person yourself by making a connection with the divine within and without, with our neighbor. So everything that has a reading number of 262 came from those books, and that -104 is telling you it's the 104th reading that came along in doing the Search for God books. The dates aren't always on there, but I add them just so it gives you context. They've already been doing these things for 6 years by the time you've gotten to this particular reading in the chapter on wisdom. Now, let me start by saying that in talking about the subject of wisdom this evening, I'll give you a little bit of background on what Cayce had to say as far as why we are on earth to begin with. Apparently, when we were all souls, before we were human, and I realize that's talking about the pre-existence of the soul, which Cayce was very big on. We don't just become created when the human body is born. The soul has always been and will always be. And so as souls, we came to the earth and started getting involved. And by that, probably a good example of that would be like Casper the Friendly Ghost. You know, where you see those cartoons and you'd see Casper come in and all of a sudden he's animating a chair or a broom or something like that. And we have the ability with this higher consciousness to come in and project our consciousness into something and literally use our free will to start affecting what happened here in the earth plane. And it turned out that we became so enmeshed, so entrapped here in the earth, and this is kind of a scary thing when you read it, because Cayce doesn't talk like this often, but he said, there was darkness on the earth as you could not understand it. In other words, as horrible as we have seen things during the time of humanity on the earth, we can't even imagine the selfishness that was enveloping the earth by the time they got to the point of just being so caught up in themselves and their own selfish thoughts that they saw no way out. That was when Emilius was brought in or asked to volunteer, so to speak, from elsewhere. He was already a perfect individual who took a band of other souls with him and said, let's go down there and help the people on earth. So the idea is when he came down, he himself got caught up in the earth plane. All right, and the Bible actually says this as well, as far as in that line that says, and the sons of man looked upon, the sons of God looked upon the daughters of men and saw that they were fair. That's the Bible quote that comes out talking about how you can come from being godlike into the earth plane and all of a sudden you get caught up in all of the selfish and carnal desires that can, that definitely affect us here. So we didn't have a clue how to become better people. Emilius came along to help and got caught up into this as well. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with this story, Emilius had a number of lifetimes that he experienced here on the earth. And in fact, I think they were all male as far as the ones that we know, even though you can come back as a male or a female. Came back as a male in a number of incarnations that are actually famous in history. One of them is Adam. Another is Enoch. Another is Melchizedek. Another is Joseph in the coat of many colors. Another is Joshua. All of those were past incarnations of this soul Emilius, whose 30th incarnation was Jesus of Nazareth. So it winds up saying, all right, through this evolution, first of all came in, made selfish choices that got Emilius or Jesus out of perfect harmony with God's loving ways, listened to the still small voice within, managed to get himself, without anyone else's help apparently, back up to being one with God, and he cleared the path by coming back in as Jesus to be the way, the truth, and the life, to be the perfect role model for all of us to follow at that time. You may have heard me talk about before this amazing thing that happens with humanity. If you're familiar with Roger Bannister, who is the first person after hundreds of years of tracking this to be able to break a 4-minute mile, and as soon as he did that, there were a dozen people that did that within the next year. When Columbus went across the Atlantic Ocean and found the Americas over here, suddenly there were many explorers that were able to do it after that time. So when somebody clears that path, shows us the way, says it can be done, and proves it, it does tend to make a difference for us. And that is exactly what Jesus has shown to anyone who has ears to hear and is able to, even if you don't have ears to hear, the example's there for when you are ready to listen to what it is he has to say. So the quote itself says, ye, talking about to everybody that was in that study group with Edgar Cayce, ye had not known sin unless the Son had come and shown thee the way. What we're trying to make clear here in this particular reading quote is that everybody was so caught up in the selfishness of the earth in the beginning before Emilius came that they didn't see any other way. Could you imagine going to Al Capone and trying to say, forgive your neighbor? 7 times 70. I mean, it's just not going to happen. When you are involved in that selfish kind of mindset right there, everything is done with power, and it's not done with love. And so this is exactly what was happening with Emilius, with Jesus coming in to be the Son to show us the way. You're going to have a number of the little sayings that come up with other sources of wisdom, and then I'll do a kind of a Cayce review of it. We do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. So there's always the perspective, and I'll tell you, one of the things that have made this the clearest to me was a gentleman by the name of Dr. George Ritchie. I have not found a recorded near-death experience that goes back further than what his did back around World War II. He was a soldier, and he was about 19 years old at the time, and had spinal meningitis and actually died in the hospital. For 19 minutes, he was in the morgue, and they had just left him on the table there, and he had a near-death experience in which he was taken around by what he came to discover was the Christ Spirit, and started showing him what life was like on the other side. And he wound up experiencing what people call a life review. Now, instead of it being a last judgment, if we have as many chances as it takes in order for us to be able to accept God's loving ways for our own, then that makes a lot of sense for reincarnation. And instead of there being a last judgment, there would be an ongoing review of the life that we just had if reincarnation is a fact, which I believe. So you wind up saying at the end of that life, you were shown every single thing, and this is how both my wife and I have had spent a day with George talking to him about this experience, not just reading his books on the subject. Anyway, the interesting part of this is that he said, you can't imagine, he goes, it's not just hitting the highlights of your life. He goes, you literally review every single moment, every thought, every choice that you just made in the life that had just passed when you were a human being on earth, and you are not seeing it from your point of view. You're not seeing it from the other person's point of view. You were given the gift of seeing it as it actually was. There was no bias in looking at it at all. And it's not condemning. It's not judgmental as in trying to make you feel bad. It's saying, when you choose this, this is what the result was. These were the effects that it had. And what winds up happening to you then is apparently we don't feel nearly as bad about the sins that we committed as we do compared to what we call sins of omission. Seeing the opportunities that were there in front of us, and we didn't choose to take advantage of that. We had the opportunity to make something happen better, to make somebody's life easier, to become a better person ourselves had we only gone and taken that step in that direction. So the sins of omission, according to George Ritchie, are the ones that really bother us on the other side, and seeing what a difference we could have made had we followed through on the things that we already knew and believed. So remember that we're talking about, from the saying here, we see things as we are, and apparently in a life review, we're talking about being able to review our lives in total, without bias whatsoever, and to see what the reality is of the choices that we made and the things that we avoided. I love this little cartoon because I think it so clearly points out what kind of troubles that we have here on the earth. You can see the guy here on the left has got one position, and the guy on the right has a different one. And which one of them is right? From where they're standing, this guy can't even imagine why he isn't agreeing with him, and vice versa. Because they're looking at it so clearly. How can you not see what's so plainly in front of you right there? So if you know that that it is a matter of perspective, how does that wind up being able to manifest in real life? Are any of you familiar with Anthony Robbins, Tony Robbins, the kind of self-help guru? Yeah, a few of you out there. He tells a story, gosh, this is one of his first self-help programs I remember from maybe 30 years ago. He was talking about a young couple that had just gotten married. Madly in love, and the honeymoon's over, and they come back and come into their first conflict. Let's leave it at that. But let me give you a little bit about their background. The woman was brought up in a rather introverted family. And if there were any conflicts in the family, how she was raised and what she learned was that nobody gets excited, nobody raises their voice, that you're very respectful of the other people and allow everyone their say, and to be able to go ahead and present your point of view, and then you quietly wait for them to do the same. If anyone ever gets excited and starts raising their voice, the thing to do is to get up, walk out of the room, and give them a chance to calm down before things get out of control. Then you can pick it up and go on from there. Now, the guy, on the other hand, grew up in a rather raucous, boisterous family, and he was raised to deal with conflict as in everybody just gets it out there, and they're very blunt about what they say, and you can yell and scream and do whatever, but the one thing that you do not do is walk out on the other person. You stick it out with them until you have got this thing worked out. Anyone see a problem here? So he's doing what he knows to do, which is, I'm going to sit in there, I'm going to be blunt, I'm going to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. And the first thing she does, and she watches this, her eyes get wide, gets up and walks out. We have a 6 and a 9, and that same situation going, they have done the absolute worst thing they could have done, when in fact, from their perspective, they were doing exactly what they needed in order to improve the situation. So if we can keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this, for Mr. 6 here to be able to understand the perspective of Mr. 9 and to not condemn him for it, may not agree with it, but to not condemn him for it is really the better part of wisdom. Wisdom is really being able to use knowledge so that it draws us closer to God. You'll see that in some of the other quotes down the road here. So we have, again, 262104, it's the same reading, or from the same set, and it's a different quote out of there. Wisdom, then, is the application of that, as is the understanding, as is the concept, in the light of that which is the ideal of the individual who applies knowledge and wisdom. One thing I do want to point out, when you see this in all caps over here, that's not me changing it. The stenographer that was taking this down word for word, Gladys Davis Turner, whenever she did that, was indicating that that was a particular emphasis on the words when Cayce was doing it. So if I were to say that as is the concept in the light of that which, you can see in the inflection of my voice, how it would be similar to what Cayce might have done back then. So what we're trying to say here is that, I remember a saying from way back. It says, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put one in a fruit salad. Okay, so if you get that kind of tongue-in-cheek way of being able to understand that knowledge is facts, and wisdom is knowing that it doesn't matter how much we know, we should only reveal that which is going to improve the situation, that which will heal others or heal some kind of a conflict between people. So it's not just enough to know everything and to tell everybody where they're wrong. If you're not making things better, it's better to keep your mouth shut. Now, using past lives from Edgar Cayce is an excellent way to be able to do this. In fact, previous life to his lifetime as Edgar Cayce, from his own readings, he was an individual in the settler, when they had the settlers coming across the nation and all that, and he had the last name of Bainbridge. And at that time, he had psychic abilities as he did as Edgar Cayce. The difference is the way he made choices back in that incarnation with his psychic ability. He got really good at poker. Imagine sitting at a poker table and knowing what everybody's cards are in their hand and the cards that are coming up in the deck in what order. So if you're sitting there looking at this, you can do really well and be able to how to figure out how to make a living and all that. So as Bainbridge, he was using his psychic abilities for, self-aggrandizement, as some places call it in the reading. And then you talk about in the incarnation as Edgar Cayce, he still had that same ability. He would not play poker. In fact, if you've ever heard of the game of Pit, P-I-T, Pit, which is a commodity trading game, he was the one, this is odd for people to know, he actually invented that game and sold it to Milton Bradley. That's kind of a weird fact that's out there someplace. But he invented that game because it moves so quickly, and the way, if you've ever played it, it really is that fast, that his psychic ability was not able to keep up with it. He was able to have a level playing field to play that game with other people, and that was why he invented it. So the point is to decide. He had the ability to be able to read poker hands. In that one lifetime, he just used it, make money for himself. In the next lifetime, he figured out how to use his gifts and service to other people. Which one did we think he gained from? He had the knowledge, the same knowledge in both lifetimes. The wisdom was understanding how to use what he knew and what his abilities were to be able to draw himself and help others to become closer to God. So the slide here says, ego says, once everything falls into place, I will find peace. But spirit says, find peace and everything falls into place. One thing I really like about this is that it pinpoints the very thing that I like about the Edgar Cayce readings over any of the other schools of thought that I have ever studied. And that is, anything else that I have talked or studied says, here we are on this earth and things aren't so great here. But there is a heaven, there is a nirvana, there is to become one with the force. Whatever it is that you believe in out there, it's always talking about, we need to figure out how to get out of this place so we can get to the good place. Edgar Cayce is so clear on the fact that we don't need to go anywhere. Do you think Jesus was any less of the Son of God, any less happy, any less being of service, any less fulfilled when he was walking, the Holy Land and doing his ministry over there as he is anywhere else? When you are Christ incarnate, when you have attained the Christ consciousness, you're in heaven wherever you go. And that's the whole point of what it is that we're here to do. We are supposed to figure out how heaven can be what we experience here on earth instead of having to go someplace else to get there. Once I get to heaven, I will find peace. And instead, the Cayce reading, Spirit says, I will find peace right here, right now, because I am the one that makes that happen or not happen. A really good example of this comes from my own family. My father was born and raised in Texas, and he was a good old boy from Texas. It was had kind of that same attitude of he was the breadwinner and my mother never worked and she stayed at home as the homemaker and to raise the kids and do all of that stuff. My father turned about 50 years old. He wound up losing his job. And what was interesting about that is he was a mechanical engineer, and he had gotten so far ahead in his field, working for pretty much the same company all those years, and he had dropped out of school in his last semester and never finished his degree. Well, you go down the road about 20, 25 years, degrees from back in World War II, not very important. Degrees in the 1960s and 70s, really damn important, especially if you're a mechanical engineer. And suddenly there he is, 50 years old, without a degree, trying to get a job that everybody else has usually got a master's in engineering by that time, and he didn't. Long story short, my father never, ever got another job that he didn't try to do through self-employment. I can tell you that the family suffered financially at that point. I mean, it wasn't that they didn't have savings to be able to draw on as he tried to get jobs and all that, but it just didn't go very well. What was interesting is how that turned around. And I mean, we were not there was no extra money being spent in that family. I can guarantee you that. We were drinking powdered milk and that sort of thing. So what was interesting was how it actually turned around. My mother winds up being an heir to great aunts, who the two great aunts themselves had actually accumulated a lot of wealth, maybe a couple of $1 million that had to be split up over 6 or 7 people that were heirs. Because can you imagine getting that much money back then and not having a will? They didn't. And so it wound up having to be split up over the heirs at that point. And it wound up being not a great, huge amount of money. It wasn't like it changed the lifestyle at all, but it did allow both of my parents, ultimately my mother, to be able to live and maintain a standard of living that didn't have to change. And she never worked a day in her life. It was because of her, just who she was, to be able to, fit in perfectly with the universe, that she was going to attract that kind of prosperity into their lives, where my father, who is the one that I'm going to be the breadwinner here, certainly he got to learn some lessons from that and find out that mom was the one that actually was able to come through. Now, here's one of the interesting things, and you're talking about 2 teenage sons, myself and I have an older brother, 3 years older, and they said, okay, first thing because we asked, what's the first thing you're going to do with the money? They're going to tithe 10% of it. They're going, are you nuts? That's exactly what we asked. Are you nuts? Is that really what you're going? I mean, here we've been powdered milk. We can't spend anything, any money on anything. What are we doing here? And you're going to give 10% of that away? And they said, absolutely right. One of the best lessons they ever could have taught us, because I have parents that walk their talk. You go out there and say, we're going to do this, and then the opportunity comes up, and then they do it. Oh my gosh. What kind of a lesson is that for your very own children? So it allowed me to be able to carry that lesson into my later years as well. But I have to say that because of my mother's faith in a God of unconditional love, a faith in the fact that we're all supposed to be prosperous, and her willingness to give back as she got it, was able to overcome the challenges that whatever karmic conditions my father had brought into the family, saying, you've got to learn a lesson here. That, you need to not think of everybody as being in this particular role or that one. And boy, it taught us that one too, my brother and I. So now, the next slide up here says, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. I had a experience, in fact, I was the executive director here of Unity of Phoenix for a few years. And I remember sitting in a meeting, it was volunteers just in the other room over there. And one of our committee members was a little late getting in there, and she came in just all frustrated. You could tell she was worked up about something, and we just stopped for a second and asked her what was going on. She said, well, I've been having trouble with my car, and I had, the starter wasn't working, and I took it down to a local auto repair shop. And he tried to tell me that I needed a whole new starter, blah, 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 listed a bunch of things. And I just didn't believe that. And so I went ahead and got the car back from him. He wasn't going to give me the car unless I paid him $75 for a diagnostic charge. And I was really upset, so I paid him the $75, and I took the car over to another dealership, and it turned out it was a very inexpensive voltage regulator that needed to be changed. And so it wasn't even $75 to actually fix what was wrong with it. I went ahead and took that bill back over to the man to get my $75 back, and he goes, I don't care what that piece of paper says right here. You're going to get a $75 diagnostic charge no matter what. And she goes, and I just left him from him telling me that, and I came over here, and I'm standing, how am I going to, I'm going to sue him, and I'm going to do it. I'm like, whoa, slow down a minute. I said, but what's really the goal here? Is the $75 that big a deal? Oh, she goes, oh, no, it's not like it's taking food out of my mouth or anything. I just feel it's the principle of the thing. And so, and you start talking to her along those lines. It said, that if you try to go to small claims court, that's going to be a real iffy situation to walk in there. You can show that somebody else fixed it over here, but there's a lot of, steps that goes in between that. You got to go down to the court, you got to file the paperwork, you got to serve it on him, you got to do all this stuff. And we're talking about $75. Do you really want to go through that? And she really felt like it was her job to make sure that justice was served. That was where it's my responsibility to make sure he doesn't get away with this. And said, no, I think that one pretty much belongs to God. Believe me, you can be the instrument by which he gets to, experience a karmic repercussions of whatever happened here. But you don't have to be. And if you can just let it go right now and allow, the karmic forces that are out there to have somebody else have to be the one to go file all that paperwork and take into court or whatever is involved, I said, I think that would be so much better. And she goes, oh, I wish I could believe that. You could tell that there was just something inside her that felt like he was really going to get away with it if she didn't take care of it right then. So you have to understand that when you're clever, you want to change the world. When you have wisdom, you figure out how to make the world better by changing yourself. A little longer quote here, still back in the 262-104. Dost thou say in thine heart and thy mind, yea, or yes, but he, talking about Jesus, yea, but he was the Son of God, or Son of the Father, and thus had the strength that is not in me. But ye are foolish, for not only art thou sons and daughters of the Father, but hath the strength in the promises of him who is life and light and the way and the water and the understanding. How many times do we think, well, if I would have been arrested and beaten half to death and a crown of thorns on my head and forced to carry that cross up to Mount Calvary and then crucified on the thing and ultimately murdered, that I would be able to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You would have to be God incarnate to be able to have that kind of a response to that situation. That's what Jesus is able to do. And we're saying, I can't do that. And the fact is, we can't. We aren't of a mindset where we could successfully do that. What I love about this reading is putting it very clearly that says, that soul Jesus is made in the image of God just like every single one of us. There is no difference. Jesus himself said, the things that I do, you will do, and greater. And greater. So therefore, everything that we see him doing out here, we go, it's impossible for me to do that, is not only our potential, but our destiny in order to be able to accomplish that. And so the strength comes in him. And when you see the capital H in the Cayce readings here, it's not only talking about Jesus and the Christ consciousness, it's talking about God as well, because they're all one at that point. So the promises of him, of God, of Jesus, of the Christ consciousness, who is all of these things that we will eventually attain for ourselves, each at a time of our own choosing, as we accept his loving ways for our own. So we wind up being able to see what it is that is reality. There is always what would Jesus do, being a much higher level than what we, or Jesus expects us to be able to do. So those are two different things right there. But if we keep striving to do better and better with each of the choices that we want to take, and we have set before us, then we're able to go ahead and say, yes, that I want to do better than I did before, and that's all we do. Line upon line, precept upon precept is a quote from the readings as far as how we go ahead and accomplish these things. So the question is, it's up to each one of us how much time we want to take before we become the better people that we were created to be. The greatest prison people live in is the fear of what other people think. One of the things that really impressed me when I think about this particular quote here is a friend of mine. Back before I retired, I had been in the mortgage business, and I specialized in commercial mortgages, and I was working closely with the largest private banking mortgage bank in Arizona called Great Southwest Mortgage at the time. They succumbed, like everybody else did, to the real estate bubble that happened way back when. But I was meeting with the owner, and it had to do with two loan officers that worked for him that both of them had brought me a deal. And I was going, I'm not sure what to do. I'm getting this deal from two different people, and I don't know what to do with the commission. So that's why I'm bringing it, to you. Here's this pot of money. How do you want to split it up between the two guys? And we talked it over a little bit. And he said, well, here's how I want to do it. And he gave me what he thought was right and fair for me to be able to do with that. And I said, yeah, that's really going to upset the other guy that doesn't wind up, benefiting as much out of this. And he goes, I upset 10 people a day. It's my job. It's what I'm here to be able to take care of. And so what happens is that he sees one guy on one side seeing a 6 and the other guy seeing the 9, but he's got to be able to see both sides and figure out 3 things. He's got to be able to figure out what's fair, what's legal, and certainly what's best for the company. Now, that's not a bad standard for him to be able to use in trying to figure out how to be able to resolve all of the issues that come up. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to be happy at the end of it, but he uses that standard. But how much different is it when we're trying to make decisions when you add another layer on top of that of the unconditional love of God? Is it fair? Is it legal? What's the best for the company are not bad standards to use when you're out there just trying to use the knowledge and facts that you have available to you. But how about what do you wind up doing when you say, all right, we have God's unconditional love here. Does that add a new dimension? Does that give me new options in order to be able to make that work? Here's a good example. In the Old Testament, it always surprised me when I would read some of those statements about Moses. And Moses says, okay, God told me that we have to go down there and kill all those people, all the men, even the male children, and we're going to have to enslave the women and raise all the babies to be part of our clan instead of the enemy out there. And we're going to confiscate all their assets while we're at it because that's what God said. And I'm going, how in the world do you take somebody that is a great spiritual leader, as Moses clearly was, and God was definitely helping him to be able to allow the Israelites, if you will, to be able to leave Egypt and go out and find their promised land. And yet he's out there contemplating murder and rape and stealing. How in the world do you reconcile those two things together? And then it occurred to me how we all do this to God. Can you imagine Moses sitting there in prayer and meditation? He's, God, show me what to do next. Show me how I can take our people to the promised land. God, I have a couple of conditions for you, though. I'm old, and so I need this to happen sooner rather than later. In fact, pretty quick. I'm that old. And as a matter of fact, the other thing is that it has to be, we are the chosen people. How many times have we heard that in the Old Testament? You are the chosen people. Talking about the Israelites. So we are the chosen people, so it has to be us, who gets it, and we have to do it sooner rather than later. Well, God was getting ready to say, you could go down there to Jericho, you can knock on the door and said, you know what, is it okay if we go ahead and come into your land? And we can show you how prosperous we can be together as a team, to be able to join our tribes together and try to make things work out in peace, harmony, cooperation, and love. Now, that was one approach. But if you put those conditions on there, it has to happen sooner rather than later. That means, well, if we go down there and blow the trumpets and march around the walls for a time so if they fall down, then we can go in there and kick them, in the butt and get them out of here and do everything else we said. And now it belongs to us, the Israelites. It's our people. You put those two conditions on God, and that's the only answers that Moses will be able to hear. He won't be able to hear a loving, peaceful, patient response out of that. You go out there and say, well, it's got to be. And now I have to say, worried about what other people will think. Moses was not in the best shape over there leading that group. Remember, he goes up in the mountain for a few days, comes back, and they're worshiping a golden calf. I mean, it wasn't like he had the greatest control over what was going on there. So he's worried about time. He's worried about what the other people are thinking. Can I continue to lead them? And the next thing you know, let's go ahead and get everybody to, all fired up and go down there. And that was the answer that he swore that he was getting from God. I guarantee you God was not telling him to do that. It was the only thing he was able to hear in terms of how to be able to get through all this. So if we will listen within to the still small voice within and be able to allow God to give us the answer regardless of what our preconceived notions, our biases are, we might be very surprised that there is a much better answer than we ever could have come up with on our own, trying to think about what's fair and legal and best for the company. I want to pick up with another of the Edgar Cayce readings. And this one, I'll read the whole thing, but I have added this underline and bolding right here for what I want to concentrate on in this particular reading. For wisdom then becomes first a matter of choice, second, a matter of will. And the light ever of that which is the ideal, as respecting the application of that to which the individuals may apply themselves, as toward an object, an experience, a goal sought. Forever these become as a triune in the experience of each individual. That's an interesting triune that he's talking about right here, that we approach everything as like an object of desire. As we go toward that object, we have an experience, and from that experience, we have ultimately a goal that winds up being something that we are trying to attain. So what happens is, have you ever seen those cycles in which you go through and say, okay, I have, this is what I believe, then I have an experience, and then I adjust that belief as I go forward. That's really what I'm reading when I see the quote right here. The triune is that we keep coming into it. We have a belief, then the experience, and then we revise everything, is really what we're going toward in this reading. Now, an interesting thing, when you start looking at it, when you said first a matter of choice, second a matter of will, it occurred to me to say, anybody can make a mistake. But if you make it again, it's a choice. It's not, oops, I did it again. Some of you have heard me talk about this more recently. I've been able to come up with an analogy, or at least a metaphor, as far as how did we ever commit the first sin? Because that one's always bothered me. I'm going, if you can wind up committing a sin when you're a perfect individual, doesn't that mean God can sin? God has the free will to sin, God just doesn't. And I said, what is it, if we were made in his perfect image, how is it that we, if we had shared in God's omniscience and omnipotence, wind up being able to make the first sin? Now, I think that first sin is a mistake. And the way that, and if we do it again, then it becomes a choice. The mistake is not anything that we could be condemned for. One of the metaphor that I come up with is, if you ever go driving around in downtown Phoenix and you wind up seeing one-way streets down there, and you try to get into a parking structure, my gosh, every time I go down there for a baseball game or some basketball game, and you have the problem of trying to go the wrong way on a one-way street to get to where you want to go. And imagine if you go there and you make a left turn, you're going the wrong way on a one-way street. You didn't mean to do it. You were just trying to go, to the parking structure over there, but there were no cars coming. And the next thing you go, say, that worked out. And the next time you go down the street and you come and you have to go to the parking structure and you kind of go up to the corner and you go, cool, Nobody coming, you make the left turn. It went from a mistake to a choice. And then pretty soon you're going, oh, darn it, there's a couple of cars coming, but I can probably get around them. So you turn left and go for it anyway. You see what I'm getting at? The first one's a mistake, not even a problem, because it is the motivation, the desire within that decides whether or not it is a sin. So you can make a mistake without it being a sin. You can't do it the second time after you know better and not have it wind up being a sin as far as that goes. So the interesting thing is as much as you wind up knowing, about this material in the Edgar Cayce readings about a God of unconditional love, it occurs to me that if we are not wise as serpents yet harmless as doves, that it's actually a choice we're making to our detriment. It isn't that you need to judge everybody as in condemn what other people are doing when you don't agree with it, but you do need to judge it from the idea of, I allow you to continue being who you are, and I'm just going to, give you some room as I go around the outside of that. I'm not going to get involved with it. We constantly need to be surrounding ourselves with a white light of protection and making choices so that we don't go down that wrong way street, if at all possible. Now, one of the interesting things is in fact, I had asked Edgar Cayce about this back when he was alive. I guess he died July 4th, 1982. Yes. So his oldest son died July 4th, 1982, and the reason I had to go through the math there is my wife actually got to meet him just months before he died, and it was before we were married, so we just barely got that one in there. And the fascinating thing is that I asked him, in growing up, he was being raised by Edgar Cayce, and going, oh my gosh, what is it like to be? People have asked me that because my mother was legendary, if you will, in the ARE, and they go, what it must have been like to be raised by Helen Ruth Schroeder. I go, okay, it has its ups and downs, and it was funny when I said that to Hugh Lynn. I said, you know what, to be raised by Edgar Cayce must have made it a real easy chore to get through life, and he goes, in so many ways it is. And he goes, and let me say this, it doesn't keep you from making any of the mistakes that everyone else makes. And I could just feel in everything that he had to say how he truly understood and believed that. He wasn't just making it up. He goes, I've made all the mistakes everyone else has out there. He goes, but we keep trying to do better. What's interesting, if you were to go back into the Edgar Cayce readings, there are all kinds of people that receive readings from Cayce that were famous people in the past. For instance, Hugh Lynn was Andrew, the Apostle Andrew. And his son, Edgar Cayce's grandson, was Luke, the physician. So there are people that were of the apostles back in those days, and they were wonderful, great people. But guess what, folks? They're still here on earth 2,000 years later. They're still working through stuff to be able to try to figure out how they're not enmeshed or entrapped on the earth having to come back into a physical body. They're trying to figure out how they can be loving, patient, kind, etc., in order to be able to not have to come back. It could be in choice if they did. And so, I start to understand from Edgar Cayce's perspective, yes, I was raised by Helen Ruth Schroeder, and it was so many things are marvelous out of that. And it's not without its challenges, and I can't say that it didn't stop me from making all the mistakes that everyone else makes. So in this picture, I don't know if you can make it out there, but this little girl has got her hands up against the window of an aquarium, and she's seeing the fish on the other side of that, obviously, and just got her rapt attention over what's going on the other side there. It says, wonder is the beginning of wisdom. It's a Socrates quote. Now, one of the things that the Bible says over and over again is that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Anyone remember that quote? Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I would much prefer to see a word substituted in there. Instead of fear, I think it should be awe, A-W-E. That when we are in awe of God, that is when we are starting to understand how to use knowledge in order to become better people, to draw ourselves closer to God. Now, one of the things I can say that causes me to be in awe of God is when you look at the world around us right now, think of how screwed up everything is. For instance, you look in the Middle East and you're going, for thousands of years, these people have been at each other's throats. How could you possibly ever get through that? Then you look on the other side of it and you go, you know what? Back in December 7th, 1941, Japanese bombed the heck out of Pearl Harbor. And about 4 or 5 years later, we went ahead and nuked them. And guess what? Not even 50 years after that, we're some of the closest allies between the United States and Japan when it comes to politics and it comes to finance and actually just being friendly with each other. Now, how can you wind up nuking another country and coming to that point where we're that friendly within 50 years, and over there in the Middle East, they're still at each other's throats and can't find it in their hearts to forgive each other? One answer to that is, we've insulted their God. We didn't insult Japan's God because that wasn't the issue between Japan and the United States. But between the Jews and the Muslims, each one of them says, I can forgive you for what you've done to me, but you can't say that about Allah, or you can't say that about the first cause that can't be named in Yahweh, in the Jewish religion. So this awe that I wind up having is knowing in my heart of hearts that God has this under control. God is not going to lose one soul in all of us in our own space and time, becoming the way that he created us in the beginning, to be one with him in consciousness, in free will choices. We're still making the free will choices, but we are making choices in alignment with his loving ways. There's still an infinite number of choices to make that are loving. So we still have plenty of latitude in what we're doing. But to be able to know that God has this all under control and is not going to lose one soul along the way is awe-inspiring to me. 2 things help success in life: the way we manage when we have nothing, and the way we behave when we have everything. All right, so what are you doing when you have nothing, and what do you do when you have everything? You remember this, a good example of this is the widow's mite. You know, and Jesus is saying, look at all these wealthy guys come here and put just a little tiny portion of their wealth in there, and it just impresses the heck out of everybody. But this woman went up there and gave them all that she had. Much more impressive to be able to do what the widow's mite story was all about. Well, the interesting one about this, is it came to my mind, had to do with Henry Ford. Henry Ford is quoted as saying, "Great wealth does not ruin anyone. It does, however, unmask those who the people truly are." So in other words, somebody hits the lottery and you get to see who and what they really are after you just throw this instant wealth on them. You say, who are you really? One of the things I've always been fascinated with in politics, like with the French Revolution, and you had the aristocracy was just really down on the common people out there and was, arresting them and killing anybody that just, didn't agree with them, and the troublemakers were beheaded, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the people got together and revolted over in France, and the next thing they did was they took all the aristocracy and they killed everybody that didn't agree with them, and beheaded the ones that were the real troublemakers, et cetera. In other words, there was no difference from one side to the other. You wound up having the same thoughts go on when they were in positions of power, whether it was the common people or whether it was the aristocracy at the time. And so you wind up having, going back to the slide here, to understand what is it you do when you have nothing compared to what do you do when you have everything, really does make it clear what's going on. Now, I do want to point out another thing. It has to do with Henry Ford, and it's a kind of an interesting story with this guy. My father's the one that told me this, and he was old enough to actually remember back to the Model A days. So the interesting thing was Henry Ford was known as being an eccentric. And when he was first coming up, remember, he didn't invent the car or the automobile, he invented mass production of the automobile, the assembly line. And one of the things, when he was getting ready to put the Model A Ford together on the assembly line, he was getting bids. He didn't build transmissions himself. He said, here's the specification of the transmission I want built, and all of you metal engineering people out there, go ahead and give me a bid, a request for proposal, RFP, and say, give me a bid on you making this transmission to these specs. And he goes, by the way, I'm going to add something else to it. And he said, I want it delivered to me in each and every one in an individual box. And the box was kind of weird because it was more round than anything. It was round, and he said, and it can't be nailed or stapled. It has to have screws and these particular things in this circle going around right there. And it has to be packed with this more like cotton fiber material than anything, instead of just using newspaper or wood shavings or whatever they had back in that time. And he goes, and that's how I want each and every one of these transmissions delivered. And they're going, this guy's nuts. And so finally, the guy who won the bid comes up with the first 1,000 transmissions, has them delivered over to the Ford assembly line, and he goes, do you mind if I see what you're getting ready to do over here with all this? And Henry Ford says, fine, come on in. Well, he watches them very carefully take all the screws out, and he hangs on to them, and they lift up the lid for the whole thing, and they wind up taking the sides around it, and they said the sides were the exact width that they needed to reinforce the fenders. The boards that were there were one easy cut in it, wound up being the floorboards for the vehicle, and the screw holes were already in the exact point to be able to install the floorboards and to be able to mount the plywood or the wood reinforcement underneath. And the stuff inside actually went into the rumble seat in the back of the vehicle. So that he wound up, remember the Native Americans use every part of the buffalo? So that, and Henry Ford apparently figured out, hey, I'm Henry Ford and I'm doing all this stuff. You're making a whole lot of money off of me, and I'll tell you how I'm going to create wisdom out of just having knowledge here. That's what happens, and you're able to go ahead and look at it from a much greater and different perspective. So here's another reading. For oft ye have found, ye have felt, ye have even reasoned, how can God love us so, and yet allow us to suffer in body, in mind, in the needs of the day, in the needs of the body, and bring into the experience of individuals those things that to us become not understood. In other words, we can't understand how there could possibly be all this suffering in the world and have there be a God of unconditional love. It just doesn't make sense to us at all. And so if you want to ask something like, why are there so many starving people in the world? Actually, I've had a little bit of an education on that. And you may have read articles on this as well, in which the United States will say, I'll tell you what, we're going to give you all this grain. And they go out there and deliver the grain, and it sits there and rots on the docks because they have no way to get it off of the docks to the people, the indigenous people in the countries where they're in. They have no ability to be able to distribute it. If it actually is able to get off of the docks, and guess what? There could be corrupt politicians on the other side that wind up, using it for their own profit. Or if it actually is starting to get delivered back there to the people, then you wind up having them fighting each other to be able to hoard it. So obviously there are lots of reasons why there could be a lack, in any one of the countries like that. But if you wind up having the destitute people even fighting amongst themselves to hoard what other people give to them, you have a real lack of cooperation. You have a real lack of understanding of how to be able to work together in order to be able to have things, work to everybody's best advantage. So until the recipients are willing to cooperate, until the recipients are willing to work together for everybody's greatest good, you're not going to be able to solve the problems over there. And I don't care how much money we throw at that problem. It's just not going to happen until everybody is of one accord. Now, there is one, what I'm trying to show here is how does wisdom take whatever is happening within a faulty system like this and make it work out. Now, I want to take one in which there wasn't enough food in third world countries, especially in Africa and in India, is this one nonprofit organization that I became very familiar with. In fact, because of here, Unity of Phoenix, and I was the executive director, we started donating pretty close to $50,000 a year to them as tithing from what this church brought together in order to be able to support this because we felt so strongly about it. Here are the problems that they addressed. Not enough clean water, not enough food, even though there was plenty of support from the outside countries like the United States and the EU and all of that to be able to help them out. If all of the problems you heard me talk about before, they didn't have distribution, they weren't able to get the stuff back to the people. And so how was this nonprofit organization going to take care of that? They even solved one other problem. There is a lot of misogyny going on with this, in which the women in those third world countries are not seen for having any value whatsoever other than keeping the home together or doing manual labor. Now, the Hunger Project actually goes to villages that are destitute, and they go through a series of I'll call it surveys and testing to be able to find the truly gifted people that are in that village. Guess what people they are? They're women. They're looking for the women in particular. Now, you know, when you draw a bell curve, there's a bell curve even in those villages when it comes to their abilities, their IQ and all that. And so they're looking for the women that are on the far right side of the bell curve that they can get in there. And they teach them English, and they teach them math, and they teach them the way of their government. And after they've got them educated, then they actually pick them up and take them over, to, if it was in India, into New Delhi, and say, and here are the government buildings, and here's how to get through all the red tape in order to be able to make sure that the stuff gets off of the docks to your village. I can't tell you what a difference it makes to be able to have the same girls that grew up in that village become women who, when they come back from New Delhi, are bringing food and water with them. Makes all the difference in the world. Suddenly, you're talking, there's no misogyny anymore. Those are people to be revered. You take care of them, you respect them, and guess what? It changes everything. It's an entirely new paradigm of how everybody works together in order to be able to do that. That is when you are using wisdom. Everybody knows if you're hungry, you need to eat. If you're thirsty, you need to drink. But how do you actually get it from point A to point B? And using cooperation while solving many of the problems that we have created for ourselves along the way. I think they are going a great, great distance in order to be able to make that happen. There's another, this is more of a business thing, but it's talking about crowd wisdom or wisdom of the crowd, is the process of taking into account the collective opinion of a group of individuals rather than a single expert to answer a question. Now, this is what I said I hope you find it interesting, because I sure did. I first ran into this in my early 20s when I was taking business classes back in college. And they were trying to point out, have you ever seen that picture of a camel, and they say a camel is what a committee would come up with if they were trying to design a horse? You wind up having all these strange things that get added on there just because of how difficult it can be to get a committee to work together. Well, the whole point of the exercise that we were going through was to see what happens when you try to make decisions on your own and then when you work within a committee, and to see which one of those comes out better. So what I'm going to show you as far as a demonstration of this is called the NASA Moon Quiz. I know you guys probably can't read that, so I'll read it out loud for you. But this literally came from NASA. This is what they trained their astronauts on before they went to the moon. And it was trying to get their minds working in a mode, because we're so used to how things are here on Earth. What happens if you're on the moon? So, you were a member of a space crew, originally scheduled to rendezvous with the mothership on the bright side of the moon. However, due to mechanical difficulties, your ship was forced to land at a spot some 200 miles from the rendezvous point. During re-entry and landing, much of the equipment aboard was damaged, and since survival depends upon reaching the mothership, the most critical items must be chosen for the 200-mile trip. Below are listed the 15 items left intact and undamaged after landing. Your task is to rank order them in terms of their importance of your crew and allowing them to reach the rendezvous point. Put the number 1 by the most important item, number 2 and the second most, all the way through 15 for the least important. Are you able to read what these are? It says box of matches, food concentrate. Can you see it in the back there? 50 feet of nylon rope, parachute silk, and all that. Now, the way that this thing went is that everybody in the classroom was handed this quiz originally. By the way, I pulled this off of NASA's website. I didn't still have it from my early 20s. If you're wondering, my God, does he really keep that? Is he a hoarder or what? No, that you can still pull it off of the NASA website as far as I can tell. I probably got this maybe 10 years ago. Anyway, you see the 15 items up there. You can, again, you can get this and be able to try it on your own in a group later on, but I'm just going to try to do a little sample here in the room. When you see the 15 items that are on here, nobody ever gets number one wrong. And you see that, and I'll say, look more to the lower left corner if you're having trouble reading it. Which one do you think it is? If you can read it, it's at the bottom. You have to have the 2 100-pound tanks of oxygen. Because if you look at it and you say, if you don't have oxygen, you're dead in minutes, right? Now, water is good if you can read that on there, because you can only live for a few days without water. So that would be it. So you have those two things. That's got to be 1 and 2. Usually that works out pretty well. I'll give you number 15 right here, because most people get that one right too. Why is a box of matches on the moon the last item you would take? Yeah, there's no trees. Nice. It's a lack of oxygen. So really their value is as a little stick. That's all it is on the moon, because if you were to strike it even against the flint, it would not light, would it? So it has no value for any kind of combustion or flame or anything like that. So the box of matches, for what its intended use is, unless you can use little sticks for something, is absolutely useless. But let's, what do you think? If we're 200 miles away, what do we know about the surface of the moon? Yeah, there's going to be some pretty, treacherous terrain up there. So does that mean that we would or would not want 50 feet of nylon rope? That's a pretty darn good thing to have if you're trying to, go up sharp cliff faces and things like that. Now here's one. Fascinating one. Stellar map. Would you rather have a stellar map, or would you rather have a magnetic compass? We have map. Anybody think compass? Does a magnetic compass work on the moon? How about if I tell you the moon definitely has a magnetic field? But what do we know about the moon that's very unusual? It does not rotate. You ever done that thing where, like when you're riding on a bicycle and you have the gyroscopic effect? It's hard to fall down after you get going on a bike because of the gyroscopic effect of the wheels. Well, that's because the wheels are spinning, and the faster they go, the more you're going to stay right on course with that whole thing. That's the problem with the magnetic compass. And you're on the moon right there, and you got this compass, and there's magnetic fields everywhere. So if you got a heavier magnetic field coming from that direction, it's going to point that way, and if you walk a few more feet and it's heavier that way, then suddenly it goes over there. It is actually, if the moon was rotating, that like centrifugal force or the gyroscopic effect of a wheel would cause a polarization, the north and south pole of the magnetic core of the moon. So the magnetic compass would be next to worthless when it comes to that. The stellar map, let's think about that for a second. Stellar map, let's say if you have it at here, and it's made up from the Earth, and you're going, let me try this. Let's say the chairs in here are the stars in the sky, and I have a map that's set with it just like this. Does that map do me any good if I walk all the way over here? Aren't those stars in an entirely different configuration? Now, that could throw you off if you're going to do it, because if you're going to think in that way, because when we're talking about how far away the stars are, the chairs from where I am, my moving 250,000 miles from the Earth to the moon would be about like that. All right, relatively speaking to all the chairs, it wouldn't be that big a motion out there. And so the stellar map would still be a great thing to be able to guide yourself by out there. How about the 2 loaded .45 caliber pistols? Great question. Anyone know the answer? Will the 45 caliber pistols, are you afraid that the moon men are going to get you? Why? All right. Now, if you were to sit there and take a 45 caliber pistol and point it straight down and fire it, is it going to make you, go up? Well, it will. There'll be a kick to it, but is that really going to help you on the moon? What do we know about the gravity of the moon compared to the Earth? It's only 1/6. So yes, it would. If you needed some kind of propulsion, you could literally point it down, hold your arm straight, hit it, and it would actually take you off of the ground in order to fire the gun like that. I'm going someplace with all of this if you're wondering what's happening here. Signal flares, would they fire if you're up there on the moon? There isn't any question it needs oxygen, but the 45 caliber pistol fires because when they compact the bullet down into the shell casing, the oxygen is actually compacted in there with the gunpowder. So it really doesn't matter, as far as being on the moon without oxygen. But what about the signal flares? The answer to that is, have you ever seen the signal flares that they use on boats? You can actually fire it into the water and it's still working underneath the water. It's because it has this solid oxygen built in with the solid, fuel that ignites and will definitely work on the moon itself. Now, do we see any problem as far as, there's the first aid kit, but, portable heating unit. Let me go with that one. Do we need a portable heating unit on the moon? Yes. If the suits didn't work, they'd be dead in seconds. So it... Yeah, I like that. Do you plug it in? Yeah. The thing that it says on the bright side of the moon, not the dark side of the moon. And I'll tell you, if you are on the moon and you have like a rock, you see the sun right there and there's a little rock, big rock actually, over here so that I can get behind it and I'm in the shadow. Unlike the Earth, if I'm standing here, it's about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, like the temperature of boiling water, sitting on this side of it, and if I step behind the rock so that the sun isn't completely, isn't shining on me, it's about 200 degrees below zero. And you're 3 feet away from each other. Why does it happen like that? Because there's no atmosphere to be able to even out. It's kind of like if you were to pour dye into a bathtub at one end, and it eventually just evens out throughout the entire tub, right? Without atmosphere, when you have the sun coming down, there's nothing to transfer it, even if you're 3 feet over. But the point is we're on the dark side of the moon, not on the light side of the moon. And therefore, if we're on the light side, we're on the light side, not the dark side, so therefore we don't need the heaters at all. Doesn't do you any good right there. Now, what was food concentrate. Do you need that? And you have, dehydrated milk? One case of dehydrated milk. And then you have a first aid kit, including injection needle. How much good is that going to do for you when you're in a spacesuit? Let me just open my mask here and go ahead and put the food inside. Is it really going to do you that much good when you're sitting there on the moon? The answer is yes. Anyone been in the military in here other than me? What happens is, and we've had to go through these exercises, when you wear these gas masks, you have these gas masks sitting in there. There's actually a place that you pull up and there is a tube that is outside of the mask and inside as well. You can pull up on that tube with your mouth, with your lips and your tongue to get the other end of the tube, and it'll insert into a water canteen, something like that, or a food concentrate where you could squeeze it from a tube and actually get it from the outside to the inside. So yes, you can do it, but you would have to know that in order to make a proper decision. Now, this isn't so important because once you have food concentrate, this is just a duplication of what's up here. So this one would be a very low priority. In terms of the first aid kit, if you can wind up being able to get whatever is in that from the outside of the suit to the inside, it's possibly of greater value there. I'm not trying to go through, oh, by the way, most people are saying parachute soak. Any reason why you'd want that? This is a higher priority than you would think. It could be shade, but they're actually saying its greatest value. And by the way, these are the NASA engineers that are saying this. It's not just me. It winds up being able to load stuff into it, make it like a knapsack to be able to carry along with you. So that was the value of something like that. Now, let me tell you what happened when I was 23 years old and I took this test, along with 25 people in the class. There's really three things that can happen. You take it yourself and then you go into a group. And inside the group, you either have worse answers than the committee, you have better answers than the committee, or the same answer as what your committee comes up with, right? Those are the only three things that are going to happen. Well, the majority of the people, so that you know, and it's fared out this way. I have done this a number of times because I went on to be an instructor myself, not for a living. Well, I guess now that I'm retired, it's a living. I still teach some college courses. But you wind up, every time I've administered this thing, the majority of the people wind up having better answers in the committee than they do on their own. Now, why do you think that is? As we were going through the room right here, and they say, is there a magnetic field on the moon? Does oxygen work with the flares right there with the 45 caliber gun? What about what happens with the 100-pound tanks of oxygen? The point is that when you have everybody in here working together, each of us has a little bit of knowledge that when we throw it into the pot in the middle, we have a greater pool to draw from to make better decisions right here. That's the way it's supposed to work in terms of why a committee can come up with better decisions. Now, not only have I been through this and I have all the answers, but I was actually very good at this before because I grew up a mile away from Disneyland and went through a lot where they had the rocket ship to the moon. And I knew all the statistics from that show. You sit in there for a 10-minute thing every time. I knew it was 1/6 of the gravity. It's 250,000 miles from the Earth. It's it's hot in the sun and 3 feet over in the shade. It's amazingly cold and so on and so forth. So you have all of those things that come up in there. But frankly, most of the people that I went to Cal State Disneyland, as they call it, is Cal State Fullerton. And most of the people had grown up in the Orange County area and have been to Disneyland themselves. So we had a lot of knowledge about this. And then you have to come up with, the answers in a group like that. Now, as I said, the vast majority came up having better answers in the committee, and then there were a few that wound up having worse answers than the committee. Now, what do you think that is telling you as an individual? Now we're talking about self-reflection and self-discovery. If the committee has better answers than you, when you're looking at it, you go, I would do well to be able to listen to other people, to be able to be open to their advice, to be able to come up with a better answer when we all put our heads together and cooperate. If you wind up with the committee having worse answers than you did, what do you think that's telling you? You need to speak up. You really need to speak up. You actually have more to contribute than you did, and you should have been able to speak up in the group and would have improved the rating that the group would have had because you participated that way. Well, the third option is the one I came up with. My answers were identical to my group. Now, why does that happen? It told me that I need to shut up. No, seriously, think of it. In one, you're undersharing, and the other one, you're oversharing. Having the correct input in terms of the balance. I'm oversharing in terms of in fact, I didn't go to college until I told you I was 23. They're all 18, pretty much, 18, 19 years old that were there. I seemed like the old guy to them at 23 years old because I waited a few years until I went back to school. So I'm in there and I just had this compelling argument for everything, that it wound up being able to talk everybody else into taking mine. Now, my position on that, I can tell you that our answers to the whole thing, when you compared, there were like 5 or 6 groups in there. There were a couple that were better and there were a couple that were worse. We wound up being about right in the middle. But had I shut up, I recognized that there were some that I had wrong in there, that we would have gotten right had I been listening to other people in the group. So it was a real learning situation for me personally to have been able to go through that. By the way, this is the actual answers right there. As far as the order of oxygen, water, stellar map, food concentrate, the FM receiver, radio, 50 feet of nylon rope, first aid kit, parachute soak, life raft, which by the way has no value other than to be able to carry stuff in the life raft, or propulsion from the automatic filling thing that's in it. Signal flares, 45 caliber pistols, the dehydrated milk, portable heating unit, magnetic compass, book of matches. So I know you can't read it from there. Actually, the people that have an advantage of YouTube at home, at this point I will have this entire slide be the only thing that's on the screen, so they'll be able to read it, but I know you wouldn't be able to. So I just have that as part of the PowerPoint if you wanted to be able to do this yourself. If you look real hard in nasa.gov, you'll be able to find it on there as well. It's called the Moon Base Experiment. So my bottom line to this whole thing is being able to figure out what is the difference, because previously we talked about knowledge and being able to understand the facts and actually get to the truth of the matter, and then there's wisdom and what you're able to take all of the things that we learned in an environment like this and figure out how to apply them in our lives so that they bring us closer to God and float all of the boats. In other words, everybody that we run into along the way is better off because of that. So that's what we're about in wisdom. I think that's it. It is it.